The fluorescent lights of Grand Central Terminal flickered against the marble walls like dying stars on October 15, 1997. At 11:47 p.m., the last Amtrak train to Boston pulled away from track 23, carrying with it the final passengers of what should have been an ordinary Tuesday night. But buried within the station's labyrinthine corridors, something extraordinary and terrifying was about to unfold. The Kellerman family had arrived at Grand Central 3 hours earlier. Daniel Kellerman, a soft-spoken accountant from Albany, clutched train tickets to Washington, D.C. in his sweaty palm. His wife, Margaret, held their 8-year-old daughter Emma's hand tightly as they navigated through the evening crowds. 10-year-old Timothy walked beside his father, his face pressed against a Nintendo Game Boy screen, the electronic beeps echoing off the terminal's vaulted ceiling. Security camera footage, later analyzed frame by FBI technicians, would show the family's final known movements with chilling clarity. At 8:52 p.m., they approached the information booth near the main concourse. Margaret appeared to be asking directions, her free hand gesturing toward the departure boards. Daniel stood behind her, periodically checking his wristwatch. The children seemed restless, Emma tugging at her mother's coat while Timothy remained absorbed in his handheld game. What happened next would haunt investigators for decades. At 8:54 p.m., the family began walking toward the lower level, following signs that pointed to track 16, where their 9:15 p.m. train to Union Station was scheduled to depart. The security camera captured them descending the marble staircase, Margaret still holding Emma's hand, Daniel now carrying Timothy's small backpack. They disappeared from view as they reached the bottom of the stairs. They were never seen alive again. Train conductor William Hensley waited at track 16 until 9:30 p.m., 15 minutes past departure time. The Kellerman family's reserved seats remained empty. Their luggage, 4 pieces checked earlier that evening, sat unclaimed in the baggage car. When Hensley finally reported the no-show passengers to his supervisor, a routine search began that would escalate into one of the most baffling missing persons cases in New York history. The initial investigation seemed straightforward, but missing persons reports were filed, and transit police assumed the family had simply missed their train and found alternate transportation to Washington, D.C. But when Daniel Kellerman failed to appear at his scheduled business meeting the following morning, his colleagues grew concerned. Phone calls to the family's Albany home went unanswered. Their car remained parked in the Grand Central parking garage, accumulating tickets. Detective Rachel Morrison of the NYPD's Missing Persons Unit took over the case on October 18th. Morrison, a 20-year veteran with sharp instincts and an obsessive attention to detail, immediately recognized that something was deeply wrong. The Kellerman family had vanished without a trace in one of the most surveilled locations in Manhattan. Morrison's first breakthrough came from an unlikely source. Janet Silver, a custodial worker who had been cleaning the lower-level restrooms that Tuesday night, remembered something unusual. Around 9:10 p.m., she had heard what sounded like a child crying from the direction of the abandoned storage area near track 16. The crying stopped abruptly, she told Morrison, followed by the sound of a heavy door slamming shut. The abandoned storage area Silver referenced was a remnant from Grand Central's earlier construction phases. Located behind a locked maintenance door, marked authorized personnel only, the space had been unused for several years. Morrison obtained keys from the transit authority and descended into the terminal's forgotten depths. What she found there would change everything. But the storage room was larger than expected, stretching back into shadows that seemed to swallow Morrison's flashlight beam. The air was stale and cold, carrying the metallic scent of old pipes and forgotten machinery. But it wasn't the room's size or smell that made Morrison's blood run cold. It was what she discovered on the concrete floor near the back wall. The small pink hair ribbon. The same ribbon that Emma Kellerman had been wearing in the security footage. Morrison immediately called for a crime scene unit. Within hours, the storage room was flooded with investigators, photographers, and forensic technicians. They worked through the night, documenting every inch of the space with methodical precision. But the hair ribbon remained the only physical evidence of the Kellerman family's presence. The forensic examination revealed troubling details. Their luminol testing showed traces of blood on the concrete floor, though not enough to suggest fatal injuries. The blood matched Daniel Kellerman's type, but DNA testing in 1997 was not sophisticated enough to provide definitive confirmation. Fingerprint analysis yielded dozens of partial prints, most too degraded or incomplete to identify. But the most disturbing discovery came when investigators examined the room's architectural features. The back wall, which appeared solid from the main storage area, actually contained a concealed doorway. The door, nearly invisible when closed, opened onto a narrow service tunnel that connected to the terminal's extensive underground utility system. Morrison realized with growing dread that the Kellerman family had somehow been led into this forgotten corner of Grand Central Terminal, where they had encountered something or someone who had made them disappear completely. The tunnel system beneath Grand Central was vast and largely unmapped, built in layers over decades of expansion and renovation. It included steam pipes, electrical conduits, communication lines, and forgotten maintenance passages. Some tunnels connected to the subway system. Others led to adjacent buildings. A few simply ended in brick walls or collapsed sections, remnants of construction projects abandoned decades earlier. Transit Authority Supervisor George Mullins provided Morrison with what maps existed of the underground infrastructure. But Mullins admitted that large sections of the tunnel system remained unexplored and uncharted. Some of those passages haven't been entered in 30-40 years, he told Morrison. Could be anything down there. Morrison assembled a search team that included transit police officers, NYPD detectives, and officials from the Metropolitan Transportation Authority. They began a systematic exploration of the tunnel network, starting from the concealed door in the storage room and following every possible path. The search revealed the underground world that existed beneath Manhattan's busiest transportation hub. Miles of tunnels stretched in all directions, some wide enough for maintenance vehicles, others so narrow that searchers had to crawl on their hands and knees. The air grew progressively colder and more stagnant as they moved deeper into the system. 3 days into the search, Officer Luis Mendez made a discovery that sent shockwaves through the investigation team. In a tunnel section approximately half a mile from the storage room, Mendez found Timothy Kellerman's Nintendo Game Boy. The device was wedged between 2 steam pipes, as if it had been dropped while someone was moving quickly through the narrow passage. Morrison examined the Game Boy carefully. The screen was cracked, but the device still functioned. The battery indicator showed it had been running for several days before dying. Most significantly, the last game saved on the device was timestamped at 9:08 p.m. on October 15th, just minutes before the Kellerman family's scheduled departure. The discovery of Timothy's Game Boy confirmed Morrison's worst fears. The family had indeed been taken into the tunnel system, and they had been alive at least initially. But it also raised new questions. How had they been persuaded or forced to leave the main terminal area? Who had led them into the abandoned storage room? And where were they now? Morrison expanded the search operation, bringing in specialized teams with advanced equipment. Urban search and rescue units used thermal imaging cameras to scan tunnel sections for heat signatures. Police dogs trained in human scent detection worked alongside their handlers in the claustrophobic underground environment. Emergency services units mapped and photographed every passage, creating detailed charts of the previously unknown tunnel system. But the underground search yielded no additional clues. The Kellerman family had simply vanished into the darkness beneath Manhattan. And as the investigation entered its second week, Morrison began examining other possibilities. She interviewed every Grand Central employee who had been working on October 15th, looking for anyone who might have seen something unusual. She reviewed security footage from every camera in the terminal, studying hours of grainy video for suspicious behavior or unexpected movements. The security footage revealed several interesting details. At 8:47 p.m., 5 minutes before the Kellerman family approached the information booth, the cameras captured a figure in dark clothing walking quickly through the main concourse. The person's face was obscured by shadows and a baseball cap pulled low, making identification impossible. But the figure's movements seemed purposeful, as if heading to a specific location. More intriguingly, the same figure appeared again on different cameras throughout the evening. At 8:35 p.m., moving through the upper-level food court. At 8:42 p.m., near the entrance to track 16. At 8:49 p.m., descending the marble staircase toward the lower level. The figures seemed to be following a predetermined route, staying just ahead of the Kellerman family's movements. Morrison realized she might be looking at the family's abductor. Someone had been watching the Kellermans, possibly following them from the moment they entered Grand Central Terminal. But identifying the figure remained impossible. The video quality was too poor, and the person had been careful to avoid direct camera angles. The investigation took on new urgency as media attention intensified. The story of a family vanishing from Grand Central Terminal captured public imagination and generated hundreds of tips from concerned citizens. Most leads proved worthless, but a few provided valuable information. Patricia Webb, a travel agent from Queens, called the NYPD tip line with a disturbing memory. On the evening of October 15th, she had been waiting for the 9:30 p.m. train to Philadelphia when she noticed a man near track 16 who seemed agitated and out of place. The man was tall and thin, wearing a dark jacket and baseball cap. He kept checking his watch and looking around nervously, as if waiting for someone who was running late. Webb's description matched the mysterious figure from the security footage. But more importantly, she remembered seeing the man leave the track area around 9:15 p.m., walking quickly toward the lower-level maintenance areas. He was alone, and he seemed to be in a hurry. Morrison interviewed Webb extensively, working with a police sketch artist to create a composite drawing of the suspicious man. The resulting image showed a gaunt face with hollow cheeks and dark, deeply set eyes. The features were generic enough that they could describe thousands of men in New York City, but it was the first potential breakthrough in the investigation. The composite sketch was released to the media and distributed throughout the transit system. Within days, additional witnesses came forward with similar sightings. A ticket agent remembered a man matching the description who had been asking unusual questions about track layouts and maintenance schedules. A security guard reported seeing someone fitting the profile, examining door locks and studying employee access patterns. Morrison began to construct a profile of the suspect. He was methodical and patient, suggesting someone with experience in surveillance or security work. He knew Grand Central's layout intimately, including areas that were off-limits to the general public. Most disturbing, he seemed to have planned the Kellerman family's disappearance in advance, positioning himself at key locations throughout the terminal. But who was he, and what had he done with the family? The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Robert Henley, a retired Transit Authority maintenance supervisor, contacted Morrison after seeing the composite sketch on the evening news. Henley recognized the face, though he couldn't immediately place where he had seen it. After several hours of searching through old employee records and photographs, Henley made the connection. The sketch resembled Vincent Torelli, a former maintenance worker who had been fired from the Transit Authority in 1995 for unauthorized access to restricted areas. Torelli had worked extensively in the underground tunnel system and possessed detailed knowledge of Grand Central's hidden passages. Morrison obtained Torelli's employment records and personal information. Vincent Torelli, age 34, had been employed by the Transit Authority for 8 years before his dismissal. His supervisors described him as competent but increasingly erratic, with a tendency to spend excessive time in isolated tunnel sections. Co-workers reported that Torelli seemed obsessed with the underground infrastructure, often talking about secret passages and hidden rooms that no one else knew about. The records showed that Torelli had been investigated twice for security violations. In 1993, he was found in a restricted tunnel section during off hours, claiming he was checking for steam leaks. In 1994, he was discovered with keys to areas outside his assigned work zone. Both incidents resulted in written warnings, but Torelli's behavior continued to deteriorate until his termination in March 1995. Morrison immediately issued a statewide alert for Vincent Torelli, but finding him proved more challenging than expected. Torelli had no permanent address, no registered vehicle, and no apparent employment since leaving the transit authority. He existed in the shadowy margins of society, invisible to most official records. The search for Torelli led Morrison into New York's underground world of homeless encampments and abandoned buildings. She learned that Torelli had been living rough since his termination, occasionally staying in shelters, but more often sleeping in the very tunnel systems he had once maintained professionally. As Morrison's investigation continued, disturbing patterns emerged. Over the past 2 years, several people had reported strange encounters in the Grand Central Tunnel system. Maintenance workers described hearing voices and footsteps in areas that should have been unoccupied. Transit police responded to multiple reports of unauthorized access to restricted zones, but searches never revealed intruders. Most chilling were the accounts from homeless individuals who sometimes sought shelter in the tunnel system. They spoke of a tunnel ghost, a thin man who moved through the underground passages like he owned them. The tunnel ghost never bothered anyone directly, they said, but his presence was unsettling. That he seemed to be watching, waiting for something. Morrison realized that Vincent Torelli had been living in the Grand Central Tunnel system for years, then using his intimate knowledge of the infrastructure to remain hidden from authorities. He had transformed sections of the underground network into his personal domain, a hidden world where he could operate without detection. But what had he been planning during those years in the tunnels? And what had happened to the Kellerman family when they encountered him on that October night? The investigation was about to take an even darker turn. As Morrison prepared to expand the underground search with new information about Torelli's likely hiding places, she received a phone call that would haunt her for the rest of her career. The call came from Dr. Sarah Holbrook, a forensic anthropologist at the New York Medical Examiner's office. Holbrook's voice was tight with professional concern as she delivered news that made Morrison's blood run cold. Construction workers renovating a section of the tunnel system had made a horrifying discovery. Hidden behind a brick wall that appeared to have been recently constructed, they had found a small chamber containing human remains. 4 skeletons, arranged with disturbing precision on makeshift beds. 2 adults, 2 children. The bones showed no obvious signs of trauma, but the forensic examination was just beginning. Morrison stared at her office wall, where photos of the Kellerman family smiled back at her with heartbreaking innocence. She had found them at last, but not in the way she had hoped, and the case was far from over. In fact, as Morrison would soon learn, the discovery of the Kellerman family's remains was only the beginning of a much larger and more terrifying truth about what Vincent Torelli had been doing in the tunnels beneath Grand Central Terminal. The chamber where the bodies were found contained evidence of long-term habitation. Personal belongings, makeshift furniture, and food supplies suggested that Torelli had been using the space as a base of operations for years. But most disturbing were the dozens of photographs tacked to the walls, showing various families and individuals in Grand Central Terminal that had been apparently taken without their knowledge. The investigation was entering a new phase, one that would reveal the true scope of Vincent Torelli's underground activities and answer the question that had haunted Morrison for weeks. Then, what had really happened to the Kellerman family in those final, terrifying hours? But those answers would have to wait. As Morrison prepared for the next phase of the investigation, she couldn't shake the feeling that the worst revelations were yet to come. The tunnel system beneath Grand Central held more secrets than anyone had imagined, and Vincent Torelli was still out there, somewhere in the darkness, waiting. The forensic examination of the hidden chamber beneath Grand Central Terminal revealed horrors that defied comprehension. Dr. Sarah Holbrook worked methodically through the evidence, her trained eye cataloging details that painted a picture of systematic terror and meticulous planning. The skeletal remains confirmed Detective Morrison's worst fears. Dental records and DNA analysis positively identified Daniel, Margaret, Emma, and Timothy Kellerman. But the manner of their death remained a mystery that would challenge everything investigators thought they knew about human predation. The chamber itself was a testament to Vincent Torelli's twisted ingenuity. Located nearly 300 feet beneath street level, the space had been carved out of existing tunnel infrastructure with remarkable skill. Electrical lines had been illegally tapped to provide lighting. A ventilation system had been improvised using existing air shafts. Water came from a diverted steam condensation line that Torelli had modified during his years as a transit authority employee. The most disturbing were the personal touches that revealed the chamber's true purpose. The walls were lined with photographs, hundreds of them, showing families and children in Grand Central Terminal. The images had been taken over several years, capturing unsuspecting travelers as they moved through the station. Each photograph was labeled with dates, times, and brief notes, written in Torelli's careful handwriting. Family of 4, Boston train, track 12, October 3, 1996. Children ages 7 and 9. Parents distracted by schedule changes. A single mother with twin daughters, Washington train, track 16, December 15, 1996. No male companion visible, carrying large amounts of cash. Elderly couple, Philadelphia train, track 8, March 22, 1997. On hearing difficulties. Confusion about platform changes. Morrison realized with growing horror that Torelli had been stalking potential victims for years, studying their behavior patterns and vulnerabilities. The Kellerman family had been just one target in a much larger predatory operation. But the photographs raised new questions. If Torelli had been surveilling dozens of families, why had the Kellermans been his only known victims? What made them different from the others? The answer came from an unexpected source. While examining Torelli's photographic collection, Morrison noticed that most of the images showed families who ultimately departed Grand Central on their scheduled trains. Only the Kellerman photographs showed a family that had missed their departure. Something about their particular circumstances had triggered Torelli's transition from surveillance to action. Dr. Holbrook's forensic analysis provided additional clues about the family's final hours. The skeletal remains showed no signs of violence or trauma, suggesting that the Kellermans had not been killed through conventional means. Toxicology tests on bone samples revealed traces of chloroform, a chemical that would have rendered them unconscious without causing immediate death. The positioning of the remains was equally revealing. The 4 skeletons had been arranged on crude beds made from stolen transit authority equipment. Daniel and Margaret lay side by side, their arms positioned as if they had died while sleeping. Emma and Timothy were placed on smaller beds nearby, their bodies oriented toward their parents as if seeking comfort in their final moments. Morrison struggled to reconstruct the sequence of events that had led to this underground tomb. Based on the evidence, she theorized that Torelli had somehow lured or forced the family into the abandoned storage room, then through the concealed door into the tunnel system. Once in the underground chamber, he had used chloroform to render them unconscious. But what happened next remained unclear. Chloroform alone would not have caused death, especially not the simultaneous death of 4 people. Dr. Holbrook's examination suggested that the family had survived for some time in the chamber before dying from what appeared to be asphyxiation or exposure. The implications were horrifying. Torelli had not killed the Kellerman family outright, but instead he had imprisoned them in his underground domain, keeping them alive for reasons that Morrison was only beginning to understand. But the investigation took on new urgency as Morrison realized that Vincent Torelli might still be operating in the tunnel system. If he had killed once, he might kill again. The hundreds of surveillance photographs suggested that he was constantly identifying new potential victims. Morrison coordinated with the FBI to launch a massive underground search operation. Teams of agents, equipped with sophisticated tracking equipment and night vision technology, began a systematic sweep of the Grand Central Tunnel network. The search area expanded to include connections to the subway system, adjacent buildings, and even abandoned sections of the original Pennsylvania station infrastructure. The search teams worked in shifts around the clock, moving through miles of tunnels that hadn't seen human presence in decades. They found evidence of Torelli's long-term habitation throughout the system. Hidden food caches, improvised sleeping areas, and stolen equipment marked his territory like the signs of a territorial animal. But Torelli himself remained elusive. He seemed to move through the tunnel system like a ghost, always staying one step ahead of his pursuers. His intimate knowledge of the infrastructure gave him advantages that law enforcement couldn't match. On the fifth day of the search, Agent Catherine Mills made a discovery that changed the entire investigation. And in a tunnel section nearly a mile from the main chamber, Mills found another concealed room. This one was different from Torelli's living space. It was smaller, crudely constructed, and filled with items that made Mills call immediately for backup. The second chamber contained the personal belongings of at least 12 different families. Suitcases, purses, children's toys, and identification documents were stacked along the walls like trophies from a hunting expedition. Each collection of items was labeled with dates spanning the past 3 years, and Morrison examined the belongings with growing dread. Most of the identification documents showed families from out of state who had been traveling through New York, and the dates on the labels coincided with reported missing persons cases from across the Northeast. The Kellerman family had not been Vincent Torelli's first victims, and they had been his most recent. Morrison immediately contacted law enforcement agencies in surrounding states and requesting information about missing families that matched the identification documents found in Torelli's trophy chamber. The responses were sobering. 12 families, comprising 31 individuals, had disappeared while traveling through the New York area over the past 3 years. The Hendricks family from Vermont had vanished in August 1995 while traveling to Washington, D.C. The Morales family from Connecticut had disappeared in November 1995 during a trip to Philadelphia. The Patterson family from Massachusetts had gone missing in March 1996 while visiting relatives in Baltimore. The list continued, each entry representing lives lost to Torelli's methodical predation. Morrison realized she was dealing with a serial killer unlike any she had encountered. Torelli didn't fit the typical profile of a multiple murderer. He was methodical rather than impulsive, patient rather than frenzied. He had created an entire underground infrastructure to support his killing operation, transforming the tunnel system beneath Grand Central into a hunting ground where families simply disappeared without trace. But the most disturbing aspect of Torelli's operation was its sustainability. He had been killing families for 3 years without detection, refining his methods with each new set of victims. The surveillance photographs showed that he was constantly identifying new targets, studying their movements and vulnerabilities. Dr. Holbrook's examination of the additional evidence from the trophy chamber provided more details about Torelli's methodology. The personal belongings showed signs of having been sorted and categorized with obsessive precision. Children's toys were separated from adult items, and valuable objects were removed and stored separately. Clothing was folded and arranged according to size and gender. The pattern suggested that Torelli derived psychological satisfaction from controlling and organizing his victims' possessions. But the murder itself might have been only part of his gratification. The extended process of dominating and cataloging the family's belongings seemed equally important to his psychological needs. Morrison began developing a new strategy for capturing Torelli. Instead of trying to hunt him through the vast tunnel system, she would use his own methods against him. If Torelli was indeed still surveilling potential victims in Grand Central Terminal, she would give him targets that he couldn't resist. The operation, codenamed Underground Railroad, involved placing undercover agents throughout Grand Central, posing as traveling families. Each team was equipped with sophisticated tracking devices and communication equipment that would allow them to signal for help if they encountered Torelli. The undercover teams were carefully selected to match Torelli's apparent preferences. Based on analysis of his surveillance photographs, he seemed to target middle-class families with young children who appeared vulnerable or distracted. The teams were trained to display these characteristics while remaining ready to respond to any approach. Agent Jennifer Walsh and Agent Michael Torres posed as a married couple traveling with 2 child actors who had been recruited for the operation. They established themselves near Track 16, the same area where the Kellerman family had been approached. Their children, 10-year-old Lisa and 8-year-old David, were actually experienced performers who had worked with law enforcement on previous undercover operations. The team spent 3 days in Grand Central, following a carefully scripted routine designed to attract Torelli's attention. They appeared confused about their travel arrangements, asked multiple questions about track locations, that generally displayed the kind of vulnerability that Torelli seemed to target. On the evening of November 12th, their patience was rewarded. Security cameras captured a familiar figure in dark clothing moving through the terminal, staying in the shadows but clearly observing the undercover family. Agent Walsh recognized the surveillance pattern from Morrison's briefings about Torelli's previous activities. The figure followed the family as they moved through the terminal, maintaining a careful distance but never losing sight of his targets. When the team approached the lower-level area near Track 16, the surveillance became more intensive, and the figure began positioning himself near exits and blind spots, as if preparing to make contact. At 9:15 p.m., Vincent Torelli finally revealed himself. He approached Agent Torres with a story about train delays and platform changes, offering to show the family a shortcut to their correct departure track. His appearance matched witness descriptions perfectly: tall, thin, with hollow cheeks and dark eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of his surroundings. Torelli's voice was soft and reassuring, the kind of tone that would put nervous travelers at ease. He gestured toward the maintenance area where the concealed door led to his underground domain, explaining that terminal employees often used the passage to help passengers avoid crowds. Agent Torres played his role perfectly, expressing gratitude for Torelli's assistance while subtly signaling to his backup teams. The family began following Torelli toward the storage room, with Walsh and the child actors maintaining their performance as anxious travelers. But as they approached the maintenance area, something in Torelli's demeanor changed. His movements became more confident, more predatory. The helpful stranger facade began to slip, revealing glimpses of the calculating killer beneath. Morrison, monitoring the operation from a command post in the terminal's security office, watched the surveillance feeds with growing tension. The teams were in position throughout the lower level, but Torelli's intimate knowledge of the tunnel system gave him advantages that concerned her. As the undercover family reached the storage room door, Torelli produced a key and unlocked the entrance to his underground domain. He gestured for them to follow him into the darkened space beyond, his voice taking on a more commanding tone. "This way," he said, his helpful facade completely abandoned. "But it's much quieter down here. No one will disturb us." Agent Torres realized that the situation was about to turn dangerous. He gave the predetermined signal for his backup teams to move in, then attempted to decline Torelli's invitation to enter the storage room. But Torelli was faster than anyone anticipated. In one fluid movement, he pulled Agent Walsh through the doorway and into the darkness beyond. His other hand produced a weapon, a modified cattle prod that could deliver incapacitating electrical shocks. "Everyone inside," Torelli commanded, his voice now cold and authoritative. Now. The undercover operation had become a hostage situation. Morrison's response teams converged on the storage room within minutes, but they found only an empty space and an open doorway leading into the tunnel system. Torelli had vanished into his underground kingdom, taking 4 federal agents with him, and the hunt for Vincent Torelli entered its most dangerous phase. Morrison knew that he had taken the undercover team into the same tunnel system where 31 people had already died. But this time her people were equipped with tracking devices and communication equipment that might give them a fighting chance. The tracking signals from the undercover team showed them moving deeper into the tunnel system, following a path that led away from the main Grand Central infrastructure toward connections with the broader metropolitan underground network. Morrison realized that Torelli might be planning to take his captives far from the terminal, into sections of the tunnel system that law enforcement had never explored. Emergency response teams equipped with tactical gear and specialized communications equipment began pursuing the tracking signals through the underground maze. The chase led them through sections of tunnel that predated Grand Central's modern construction, remnants of infrastructure from New York's earliest transportation systems. As the pursuit continued, the tracking signals began to fade. The underground environment was interfering with electronic communications, and the distances involved were pushing the equipment beyond its operational limits. Morrison faced the terrifying possibility that her people would disappear as completely as Torelli's previous victims. But Agent Walsh had anticipated this problem. As Torelli forced the team deeper into the tunnels, she had been leaving a trail of small tracking devices, dropping them at regular intervals to mark their route. The devices were designed to create a breadcrumb trail that rescue teams could follow, even if the main tracking signals failed. The breadcrumb trail led Morrison's teams through an underground world that defied imagination. Miles of forgotten tunnels stretched in every direction, connecting not just to Grand Central but to subway lines, utility systems, and abandoned infrastructure from decades of urban development. It was a hidden city beneath the city, and Vincent Torelli had made himself its undisputed ruler. Following Walsh's trail, the rescue teams discovered more evidence of Torelli's long-term operations. Hidden chambers containing supplies, weapons, and disturbing collections of personal items from his victims. The scope of his underground kingdom was far larger than anyone had imagined. But they also found something else, signs of recent construction and modification. Torelli had been expanding his domain, creating new chambers and passages that would allow him to extend his hunting operation beyond Grand Central Terminal. But he was planning to become a subway system serial killer, targeting victims throughout the New York metropolitan area. The rescue teams followed the breadcrumb trail for more than 2 miles before reaching its terminus, a large chamber that appeared to be Torelli's primary base of operations. The space was lit by stolen electrical connections and furnished with items taken from his victims over the years. It was part museum, part prison, and part tomb. Vincent Torelli stood in the center of the chamber, his 4 hostages arranged around him in a grotesque tableau. He held the modified cattle prod in one hand and a homemade explosive device in the other. His hollow eyes reflected the chamber's harsh lighting as he spoke to the rescue teams through a stolen transit authority radio. "You found me," he said, his voice carrying a mixture of pride and resignation. "But you are too late to save them, just like you were too late to save all the others." Morrison entered the chamber carefully, her weapon drawn but pointed at the ground. She could see that Torelli was prepared to kill his hostages and himself rather than surrender. The explosive device appeared sophisticated enough to collapse the tunnel section, burying everyone in tons of concrete and steel. "It doesn't have to end this way, Vincent," Morrison said, trying to establish a connection with the killer. "Tell me about the families. Help me understand what happened to them." Torelli laughed, a sound that echoed off the chamber walls like breaking glass. "You want to understand? Look around you. This is understanding. This is truth. Up there. Up there." He gestured toward the surface. People live their little lives, never knowing how close they are to the edge. Down here, I show them the edge. I show them what's real. Morrison realized that Torelli saw himself as some kind of teacher or prophet, using murder to reveal what he perceived as fundamental truths about human vulnerability. His victims had been sacrificed to support his twisted philosophy about the nature of existence. "The families trusted you," Morrison continued. "They followed you because you seemed helpful, and that trust meant something to them." "Trust is an illusion," Torelli replied. "I showed them that. In their final moments they understood. There is no safety. There is no security. There is only the darkness, and what waits in the darkness." As Torelli spoke, Agent Walsh was slowly working to free herself from the restraints he had used to secure the hostages. Her training in escape techniques was proving valuable, and she managed to loosen the bindings without attracting his attention. Morrison kept Torelli talking, drawing out his philosophy and methodology while her people positioned themselves for a potential rescue attempt. She learned that his transition from surveillance to murder had been gradual, starting with a single family in 1995 and escalating as he refined his techniques. Each kill had reinforced his belief that he was revealing fundamental truths about human nature, the fear in his victims' eyes, their pleas for mercy, their final desperate attempts to protect their children. All confirmed his worldview about the illusion of civilization and safety. But Morrison also detected something else in Torelli's rambling monologue: exhaustion. The years of living in the tunnels, of planning and executing murders, of maintaining his underground kingdom, had taken a psychological toll. He was ready for the game to end. "You are tired, Vincent," Morrison observed. "This has been a long journey for you. Maybe it's time to rest." Torelli's grip on the explosive device loosened slightly. For a moment his hollow eyes showed something approaching relief, and the burden of being the tunnel system's predator was heavier than Morrison had realized. That moment of hesitation was all Agent Walsh needed. She broke free from her restraints and lunged toward Torelli, knocking the explosive device from his hand while shouting for her teammates to take cover. The chamber erupted in controlled chaos as Morrison's tactical teams moved in to secure Torelli and free the remaining hostages. The explosive device, still armed but no longer in the killer's control, was carefully neutralized by bomb disposal experts. Vincent Torelli offered no resistance as he was taken into custody, and the fight seemed to have left him completely, replaced by an almost catatonic acceptance of his fate. As he was led through the tunnel system toward the surface, he spoke only once. "You will never find them all," he said quietly, "and the darkness keeps its secrets." Morrison knew he was referring to additional victims, families that had disappeared into his underground kingdom, without leaving traces in his photographic collection or trophy chamber. The investigation would continue for months as teams searched every accessible section of the tunnel system. They found evidence of at least 6 more families, bringing Torelli's total victim count to 49 people over 3 years. The scope of his operation made him one of the most prolific serial killers in American history, yet he had operated without detection in the heart of New York City. Vincent Torelli was ultimately convicted on 37 counts of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment without possibility of parole. He provided no cooperation with ongoing investigations and offered no explanations for his actions beyond the rambling philosophy he had shared in the underground chamber. The tunnel system beneath Grand Central Terminal was extensively renovated following the investigation. New security measures were implemented, abandoned sections were sealed, and the entire underground infrastructure was mapped and monitored to prevent similar crimes in the future. But questions remained. During his years in the tunnels, Torelli had spoken of the darkness as if it were a living entity that demanded sacrifice. Some investigators wondered if his isolation in the underground environment had contributed to his psychological breakdown, or if the tunnels themselves had somehow influenced his transformation from maintenance worker to methodical killer. Detective Rachel Morrison retired from the NYPD 6 months after Torelli's capture, unable to shake the memories of what she had discovered in the depths beneath Grand Central. She had solved one of the city's most horrific crimes, but the victory felt hollow when weighed against the lives that had been lost. The Kellerman family, along with Torelli's other victims, were finally laid to rest in services attended by hundreds of people who had been touched by their stories. Their disappearance had revealed the existence of a hidden world of terror beneath one of America's most famous landmarks. Today, Grand Central Terminal operates much as it always has, with millions of travelers passing through its marble halls each year. Most know nothing about the underground chambers where Vincent Torelli conducted his reign of terror, or the families who vanished into the darkness beneath their feet. But sometimes, late at night when the last trains have departed and the terminal grows quiet, maintenance workers report strange sounds echoing from the sealed tunnel sections, footsteps in abandoned passages, voices calling from behind brick walls, and the sounds of children crying in spaces that should be empty. The darkness beneath Grand Central keeps its secrets, and some secrets, once buried, never truly rest.